Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode of Why Does It Feel So Wrong to Be Human at Work? Today's episode, we're going to be talking about why does it feel so wrong to say no at work? But before we dive into that, Pinaki, how have you been doing? What's new?
Doing good. Not bad at all. It's one of those times in life, I think in work right now, that I am doing so much, but I enjoy everything that I'm doing. So it's like difficult to figure out what to say no to, I suppose. This might be fitting for this episode. How are you doing, Chris?
Yeah, same thing. For me, it's been really busy on both ends with work and at home with the family. My kids, they're both teenagers. They're both involved in a lot of different activities. And so it's trying to stay up to date with that. And also at work, I'm finding more and more that my inbox is this thing that I have to just try to tame. And I'm finding more and more it just gets harder. I don't know about you, but it's harder for me.
Seriously, my calendar is feeling like a losing game of Tetris at this moment.
Yeah, no, I feel you.
So, you know what? I was thinking about this topic today. We were talking about, why does it feel so wrong to say no at work? And a story that popped up in my mind, looking at it from a few different angles, was right now, my agency, Local Wisdom, we have a really tight and amazing culture. And people are happy, people enjoy working with each other and everything like that. And, there was a time in the past where I thought the same. My talent manager and internal communications manager, she approached me and she was like, Pinaki, what you think about what people think about your company isn't exactly what they actually think, right? So it was like people who work here felt something different or had a different perspective than I had on what it is feel to work here. But it kind of took me by surprise. I was like, oh, really? I'm not getting this. And I was like, so what do they think? You know what they said? You know what she said to me?
What's that?
She couldn't tell me. And I was like, what? I was like, you can't. I was like, all right, you can't give me that, drop a bomb like that and not tell me. But she was like, people have entrusted her with certain information and their feelings and thoughts. So, she cannot, break this, trust and relationship by just putting that out there. So I was like, okay, what do we do? And it just felt so really odd to me that it's difficult to just open up and say these things to me. And I'm like a leader in the organization. So why was it so hard to talk to me, right? Why is it so difficult to say, Pinaki, I think something was wrong or awkward? We actually had a great session and got to that. But have you ever experienced something like that in your side of business? Any stories on when it was difficult to bring it up or say no? Or
I mean, all the time. I think when I think about the power dynamic at work, I can think of so many times in my career where you don't agree with the direction that leadership is going, or something that a colleague says. And I whenever these things happen, Pinaki, I always find that I'm examining my relationship with colleagues and with leaders. And there is, depending on the corporate culture and how much psychological safety is baked into the corporate culture, I find myself to varying degrees holding back on things that I might want to share with people in terms of my own ideas or things that I think should be things that I think are great for the organization. And yeah, it's a funny thing. It's just telling someone that their zipper is down or that they've got spinach in their teeth, or to disagree with a colleague, or to question something that a leader is saying. It's a funny dynamic, and it does feel uncomfortable at the best of times.
That's right. So yeah, let's jump into this topic, right? I'm so interested in hearing more and our thoughts about this. So yeah, why does it feel so wrong to say no at work, right? And at the end of the day, all of those things, to go against the grain, to disagree, right? Like you just said, it happens when we're talking to our peers, but it's also really difficult when we're talking to people that are more senior or in leadership roles, right? And I think about this in terms of why is it so difficult to just confront the core issue or the thing that we're facing, right? We talk about the role of hierarchy and control and ego and a whole bunch of other things that just kind of come together in this soup of stuff that we're working with, and soup of emotions that we're working with when we're in the workplace, right?
Why do you think it does happen, especially with the hierarchical structure? Why do you think it's hard for people to confront issues with their manager or their boss? Like, where do you think that came from?
Yeah, right. I think it goes. Well, you know what? If you think about it, it's we've been like conditioned for this since like a really, 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 really long time ago, right? Like we've known hierarchical relationships since like the beginning of history. It feels like even like if you think about like from Mesopotamia and Egypt and India, right? We've had like kings and empires. We've had like pharaohs organizing laborers, and we've had caste systems, and we've had governments and militia and bosses, right? And from a very, very young age, we're, taught that we have to like listen to our elders and respect our elders. And we're taught to listen to this chain of command, right?
For sure. And I know when I was a kid in school, there's so many times where I would get an assignment back from a teacher, and I found myself disagreeing with what the teacher was saying about the assignment or different elements of it. And at times it felt like it was a frustrating experience. And one of the things I always think about is how the public education system came to be in the first place, which is, I think it was back in the 1800s, somebody named Horace Mann was tasked to reform the public education system. And this was at a time when manual labor was just so important for companies at the time, and they needed workers that were docile and obedient and weren't going to question their bosses because time is money. And so, what Mann or Horace Mann did was he tried to develop a school system at the public level that helped prepare the kids to be docile and obedient. And so kids in school, they're learning that, okay, you've got to do things on time. You've got to match your teacher's specific expectations. And you got to respond to bells and, these kinds of things. And so critical reasoning wasn't like a huge focus so much as you have to memorize your times tables, and you have to get high grades and do things exactly as you're instructed. So I can't help, honestly, Pinaki, thinking that a lot of it starts in childhood, in the way that we're raised and the way that we're educated.
It's so absolutely true, and right, that goes into like I think Sir Ken Robinson did an amazing TED talk on that, on like how schools kill creativity because they were built with the model of like the assembly line behind it, right? Like, so you kind of do things like you go from like grade to grade to grade to grade. You kind of like an assembly line of kids moving through that chain. And it's funny, you like mentioned the public school system. I think a lot has changed in the public school system, but it reminds me of my son when he went to Montessori school for a bit. And I don't know, do you have any experience with Montessori school teaching or anything like that, Chris?
No, my kids didn't go to the Montessori. We kept them in the public
Yeah,
schools.
no, it's this was my first time as well experiencing that, and it was pretty eye opening and interesting. They had like scenarios where like they had multiple ages or multiple grades in the same class, and like so some of the older students would actually be teaching the younger students in that same grade. So it was like this area of like you're learning together, and the activities that they had were so geared towards just learning and building a creative mind. And they had certain interesting disciplines in there too, like, you decide what you want to work on or what you want to do, and there's little games and toys that'll be activities that'll help you learn, and you'd go and a student would go and grab an activity, bring it to an area, play with it, and then when they're done, they'd wrap it back up and then put it back. So it was like learning, it was very self-guided from the beginning, right? So it was just like continuously exploring the creativity of it. And then so like when my son went back into public school, after that, it was interesting. We got like things from the teacher that was like, yeah, so, I handed your son this schoolwork to do. And he was like, I just don't feel like doing it right now. And, they were like, what the heck is that? Right. But if you think about it, right, like, if you're doing something when you don't feel like doing it, are you going to do the best at that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And just coming back to this idea that we have been conditioned over time so much to obey, especially authority figures. And I don't know. Do you know about the psychology experiment that Stanley Milgram did? I don't know when it was. It might have been in the 1930s or something like that. Have you heard about this one, Pinaki?
No, tell us.
So Stanley Milgram did this experiment where there was the subject, and they were placed in a booth, and what they were supposed to do is ask math questions, like basic math questions, to another person that they thought was a subject, but actually was a confederate. It was somebody who was with the experimenters. And so the only person that's a subject is the actual person in the booth asking the questions. And there's a series of buttons with different voltages. And what they were explaining to the subject, the unsuspecting subject, was when you ask a question, if they get it wrong, click the first button, and what that will do is it'll give them a tiny electrical shock. And if they keep on getting questions wrong, there's higher voltages. And so they're trying to test the idea that but by having this pain associated with getting the wrong answers, that people's performance might become better. But that's not actually what they were really testing for. They were just testing this person's ability to obey, even though they're inflicting pain on somebody. And so the confederate on the other side of the booth obviously was not attached to any electrodes. There's no electrical shocks or anything like that. But so they started this experiment, and they would ask a question, and the confederate would answer a couple right, and then all of a sudden they would say one that's wrong. And so the suspect would touch the button, and it would administer a tiny electric shock, and it's fine. So then they moved on. Then they got another question wrong a little bit later, and so the subject had to up the voltage a little bit. That was the thing. And then this time, when they updated the voltage, the confederate would just have an exclamation. It's like, "Ooh, I felt that one." And they started to go along the path, and they started to study how far would they go. And it would get to a point where the confederate would be like, "Oh, that really hurt. Actually, that really hurt." And it's at this time where subjects would start to question, saying, "Hey, is that person okay?" And there was a person in the room who was presumably the person conducting the experiment, wearing a lab coat, had a clipboard, and they would say, "No, this is the experiment. You have to keep going." And for a lot of people, that was enough, and they just kept on going. But then there would be times where the person on the other side, the confederate, was clearly in pain. It's like, "Oh my God, please stop this! It hurts so much." And at this point, the subject would be like, "We can't do this anymore. The person's clearly injured," and they would look to this person with the clipboard and the lab coat and keep on asking, "We can't do this anymore. We can't do this." And the person in the lab coat would be very consistent, saying, "I know, but this is the experiment, and we've been doing it this way. You have to keep going." And so eventually, at the end of the dashboard of buttons, there's one that just said XXX or something like that. And they wanted to see how many people would go all the way to the end. And they found that a shockingly high number of people went all the way to the end. Even when, after a certain point of these high voltage buzzers, eventually the confederate on the other side just stopped responding, right? And even then, the person in the lab coat would say, "Yeah, but this is an experiment. Please just continue going." And it's just incredible. It was, to me, and I learned about this when I was in first year university. I was in my psychology 101 course. And I remember just thinking to myself, man, is that what we've become? We're such sheep that somebody that is in an authority position has so much influence over us that we're even willing to do things that are completely against our personal moral compass. And there's actually a song that Peter Gabriel wrote exactly about the Stanley Milgram experiments. It was in his album So, and it was called "We Do What We're Told," and it's just an incredible commentary on where we're at. And I find that vestiges of this still feel like we see it in organizations all the time, where authority figures, just because they have a fancy title, they're saying, well, this is the way we should be doing it. There's not a lot of room for people to say, it's not right. This is not it's not as, as extreme as inflicting pain, but it happens all the time in organizations where organizations continue doing the wrong thing because the highest paid person in the room is saying this is the direction we're headed in.
It's so true, right? And like, and it's just like you said in the experiment. It's just like we're definitely okay with inflicting a whole bunch of like little pain, right? Which is sad and unfortunate. And I think that takes like some responsibility on all angles to take a look at that and say, hey, wait, you know what? We have to do something about that. But you're right? Like we've been conditioned that, if we don't do what we're told, there'll be consequences. And sometimes there are no consequences, but it's just a fear of the consequence, right? Because, like in that experiment, like we didn't know what the consequences of not pushing that button would be, but people just kept doing it, right? Right. So like, how does this show up at work, right? Like, like when control reaches this like higher level, and it causes pain, right, to other places, right? Like, how does that show up? We have like different needs sometimes, right? Where like someone is like, hey, we need to go right, and you're thinking, I think we need to go left. Like, what stops you from saying it? And it's particularly more difficult if it's like someone of authority, right?
Yeah, so most definitely. I think one of the things that I found was interesting was the nature of leadership and how it's been evolving over time. I think what was considered, top leaders back in the 1980s is definitely different than what an evolved leader looks like in 2023. And I remember reading something from MIT Sloan that talks about, three different versions of an evolving leader. And so one is what they called an eroding style of leadership, which is, I think, the ones that tend to get more parodied now in movies and caricaturized, where you have like top-down leadership, command and control. It's permission-based. There's, it's kind of the blowhards that you sort of think about when you think about comic book bosses. And then there's a middle part where they talk about the enduring style leadership, where there's a focus on the customer, profitability, performance, and these are always going to be important. And then there was a version of leader that I thought was really interesting, which is they're calling it the emerging style of leadership, which is much more empathetic, has a higher EQ, is focused on connecting people to purpose. And I don't know about you, Pinaki, at Local Wisdom and with clients that you're working with, but there definitely seems to be a desire with each successive generation to feel like they need to be part of something that they believe in and that they feel is connected to purpose.
Absolutely. We definitely do see that here, right? And I think it's like really difficult for certain leaders to make that jump from like those three different states that you mentioned, right? Like in the eroding style, you said like someone needs to open up their eyes, right? Like this is just wrong. We need to like work on something. And then what was the three ones? Eroding, emerging, and the third one was enduring.
Enduring,
right?
Yeah.
So yeah, in the emerging one is very interesting, right? Like I think the going from emerging to enduring is a tough nut to swallow, right? Like going from like, hey, I outcomes, profit, results, and whatnot to how can I best support you to create outcomes, or how could I motivate you? Right. When I became CEO of this company, I addressed the company, or my mindset was that I'm not here to tell you what needs to be done. I'm here to inspire you to do what needs to be done, right? And there's a difference there, because there's part development and growth there. Example is because like most people don't work exactly in the same way where I think they work. They don't think like me. People are different, right? There's different rationales and reasons and peaks and valleys within each person's day, and learning styles and everything like that, right? Like one example, like think about it, was like, the other day I told my son, hey, I need you to take out the trash at 5 o'clock. And he responded, hey, I'll do it at like 9 p.m. I'm like, whoa, the audacity. Like, what should I do? What should I say, right? Does your son have any chores or whatnot? Do you get him to do things?
Yeah, 100%. And I know my son, when we ask him to do a chore and he delays it, what invariably happens is he just forgets. It's not that he intentionally is not wanting to do it. He'll just forget because he's absorbed in video games, or texting with one of his friends, kind of a thing. And there is a temptation to say, no, you got to do it now. And then my son always asks the legitimate question: why does it have to be done now? Why can't I just do this later? And it's a very legitimate question. And I don't know how you deal with it with your son, but it always makes me think that he has a great point.
Exactly. Like why does it have to be now? And there's a bunch of reasons for that, right? Like, maybe we're losing out on an opportunity, right? I think about the garbage situation. Maybe there's garbage pickup that day, right? And maybe I have to answer to someone else, like my wife, or right? Or maybe it's just me like ego tripping, like, what? Like, listen, I'm your dad. You're gonna do what I say, and there's an ego or power thing behind it, right? And there are times when we just don't even have the capacity in our minds to even like negotiate the situation. We're like, look, I just can't even deal. I'm just overburdened. So just please just do it, type of thing, right? There's so many more like possibilities that could be in the place. And like in your scenario is like, well, I've noticed that whenever I have given you more time, you end up forgetting about it, type of thing. Me, I like to say this as a form of negotiations. As if I say 5 o'clock and he says 9 o'clock, I'm like, all right, good. You said 9 o'clock. So, it'll get done. And, it at least gives him the time to finish up whatever he wants to do. Giving him the time to decide when he wants to do this puts like the onus and responsibility on him, right? And that's what I talk about later on. If like he doesn't get it, like, hey, you said at 9 o'clock, where is that? And it's not about like me, well, like, hey, I said at 5 o'clock and it has to be this time, and then he's like somehow blaming me for the time or anything like that, right? So it's giving them the slack to have accountability and responsibility to do it in the time that's going to work best for them, right? But like you were saying, like for a number of reasons, as leaders, we might not come back as flexible.
I think it boils down to trust. And I remember I used to lead a team at an insurance company. And a friend of mine who works on the agency side was saying to me, because this team that reported into me was remote, meaning that they worked in an office that was about an hour drive from Toronto. And he said, it's so important that you're there in the building with your team. And I always found it was an interesting comment, because I would come in maybe once or twice a week to check in on the team, but I always found it was a strange comment. And for me, it felt like, the reason why you have to be there is because you don't trust that they're doing the work. And so for me, I think as a leader, showing that you trust your team to do the things, to do them the way that they need to be done, I think is such an important part of being a good manager. And but the reality is that in so many organizations, people managers that are promoted into those positions are promoted not necessarily because they have wonderful leadership skills, but a lot of the time it's because they're very competent or they're very experienced, or they deserve a chance to be promoted and lead a team, and then they're not properly equipped to get the most out of their team. And a lot of that comes around to trust, and this idea that leaders think, it's going to be faster and easier if I just do it myself, right? And they're not giving people an opportunity to succeed and also to fail. And, I think it's that fear of failure that leads to, an erosion of trust in general between people managers and their teams.
I think you might be onto something. You said like fear of failure, right? And it might be one of those things of like as a leader or even as a professional, because we all have the capacity to lead and interact with other people. So this happens in a leader level, but it also happens in everyone level. So we could just say that out loud. But the idea that what drives you or what drives this decision, is it fear, right? And I think that's one, I think a trigger point that we have to like look at, because fear will drive us into like doing crazy things, I think, right? Like and I don't know if we always get the best out of it, and I think there's some good and bad, right? Like the drawback in it, right? Like we've heard stories or multiple stories of like, the leadership launching a multi-year aggressive strategy with goals and pushing this down to their employees. Like, we have to hit this and we have to hit this. And I think there's a good in that, whereas like leaders or people, we have to push each other, but there's a negative in it too, where if we're pushing too hard and not being able to really understand or take feedback, like, is there a better way? Is it a different way? Is this even possible? Right? When you make a pressure scenario that's so tight where you back your employees into a corner, there's this like fight or flight thing that's going to happen. And if they fight, there could be things like, unscrupulous acts and lying and cheating and finding ways to fool the system. And we've seen the fallout of things like that in multiple years, at multiple times. And I think that goes back to that idea of psychological safety that you talked about, right? Both your son, my son, are safe enough to say, why? And can I do this at this time, right? Like, the employees of a company should be able to go back to leadership and say, this does not seem doable, right? I don't think it's doable this way, and this is what's going to happen if we continue down this road. Now, there is a positive in it too, I have to say too, because I think as leaders we have to push, right? Like, we do have to take the garbage out so the kitchen doesn't stink up, right? And I think of like leaders in my life, like my football coach, right? So in high school I played football. I wasn't good. I just joined senior year because, the doctor said I should join a sport and that'll help me lose weight. And I joined the sport that most of my friends were. But also senior in high school, I was doing a whole bunch of other things. I was in a debate team. I was in Harvard Model Congress. I was in the science club and I had a job at the same time too. And, I felt like this was just too much. And so I went to the coach one day and I was like, Coach, I want to quit the team. There's just so much going on. And my coach was also the head disciplinarian of the school. And he basically listened to what I had to say very intently. And then he said no. And then he further went on to say that if you miss practice, you'll get detention. So I kept going to practice, kept going to the games. And you know what? We won state championships that year and got a big fat ring out of it too. So like, I appreciate him for seeing me for what I can and can't do, knowing my limits and pushing me to that limit to achieve great things, right? So there are things about leadership and pushing that are done well or that do push us to new heights. So I think it's important to acknowledge that as well. But what do you think about some of the new paradigms, right? Like, what are modern leaders doing? Like, because this story, even about me in high school, that took place in the 90s. That was also a different time, right? So what are practices that are like time tested that'll never change? What are folks doing now?
So I think it does come back to this conversation about trust that we've been having, and I think I still remember there's like a 2-minute video on YouTube. If you just search on YouTube for Simon Sinek, and I think it's Navy SEALs, he talks about one of his clients being the Navy SEALs. And, the Navy SEALs, I think we all understand, are these are people that are considered to be the best of the best of the best of the best. And what he was asking his client was, how do you choose people who are worthy of, being part of the Navy SEALs? And what his client was saying was that he basically drew a chart. So I think the y-axis was performance and the x-axis was trust. And he was saying that in the upper quadrant, the upper right-hand quadrant, obviously everybody wants high performance, high trust people on the team. There's no question about that. And then obviously nobody wants the low trust, low performance players, and you're not going to promote them into leadership roles in the Navy SEALs. But the interesting piece was when you look at people who are slightly lower performing but high trust versus low trust and high performing, his client said an interesting thing, which is we'll always choose the person that's high trust and maybe slightly lower performance, because when you think about the work that they do, it's so important. And then what Simon said was, he talks about how organizations have lots and lots of ways to measure performance, but they don't have a ton of ways to measure trust and the efficacy of leadership in that way. And so I think it's an interesting area to look at. And you and I now have talked about psychological safety a couple of times now. And I think there are opportunities for leaders to look at fostering a stronger sense of psychological safety within the workplaces. Because in the end, the benefit of psychological safety, and we should talk about what psychological safety actually is. We've been mentioning it a few times, but I think the in the absence of psychological safety, we talked a little bit about fear and distrust, and that gets in the way of the things that should be getting done from actually being done, because you're waiting for someone to tell you to do it, as opposed to taking the initiative. And exactly like you said, with our sons taking out the trash, giving them a sense of ownership and saying, yeah, if you can't do it right now, that's no problem. You can do it a little bit later, and empowering them to have that freedom to say, yeah, I know I have to take out the trash, but I'm not going to do it right now. I'm going to do it a little bit later. And I think, in an environment where there is psychological safety, and that your son can say, hey, I can't do it right now. I'm going to do it a little bit later, but I will do it. I think when you remove some of these blockers of fear and leaders getting defensive, you have a great opportunity to have more innovation, people working a little bit harder, because this is the path to getting everyone to be on the same page and believe in a common goal.
That's so wild right there too, right? And that is an awesome YouTube reference from Simon Sinek, and it made me think what you just said about corporations have tons of ways to measure performance, but what about measuring trust, right? And it made me think about how do we measure performance? And we measure performance by measuring against what we've done in the past, right? And I suppose if we're just constantly measuring ourselves from what we've done before, where's the innovation in that, right? How do we break out of that, right? And if you look at it, right, some of the top paying jobs right now didn't exist 10 years ago. The top Fortune companies weren't on that list 20 years ago, right? They're knocking other people out. The world of technology is moving so fast and is changing so fast. If we keep measuring ourselves by the things that we've done in the past, we'll get outdated really quickly. And so trust is an interesting thing right there, right? So if you give people trust and the accountability to get to the end result, I think they'll get there in a way that works for them, in a way that works for the organization and things like that. Fear was a fun thing. I'll share a quick little story. I remember we few years ago, we hired a new salesperson, Julia, who came on the team, and Julia is awesome. But she has this like straightforwardness about like how she works with clients and prospects that I'm not used to. And, one of the first times we were working with a client, like we got a estimate together and a scope of work, and she just sent it off and said, "Hey, you ready to sign? Let's go." And I was thinking to myself, "Oh my God, I would have like set up a meeting to talk about it, to do these things." But and I was going to respond and say, "Hey, let's set up some time." But then I was like, you know what? Let me just not. And then client was just happy with everything. They signed, and we just moved forward. So it was like my fear in that scenario would have stunted the movement of this sale or this account, right? So it's like me going back to what has performed for me in the past was not a good indicator of what was going to work in this scenario. So it's interesting how we have to acknowledge that.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about creativity and we talk about teams that are able to think better about what kind of outcomes you want to achieve, freeing people from the blockers of being able to share their opinions for fear of either being reprimanded or being told that they're wrong by leaders, and that might prevent them from getting promotion or a raise. I think these are the blockers that every leader kind of has to be intentional about removing, so that people don't feel that sense. If you say something and it's not relevant or it's not a good idea, there shouldn't be anything wrong with that. People should feel safe to say, yeah, what about this? It's like, actually, you know what, we already thought about that. And instead of discouraging that, saying, you know what, stay in your lane, keep doing what you're supposed to be doing, and don't question the decisions we're making. I think that gets in the way of great ideas. I remember years ago, I had a creative team that reported into me, and we had to hire a new designer. And the manager on the team, he sent me a number of portfolios, and I looked at them of candidates for this role. And the portfolios were all stunning. They were really great, but it wasn't really quite getting at what I needed to understand about who might be the best fit for the team. And I said to the manager at the time, I said, you know what, pick out the 4 or maybe 5 best candidates that you think would be a good fit in the team, and show me their portfolios. And then do me a favor. I asked him, can you ask your candidates to just give them a very simple brief, and that is design a box. And honestly, Pinaki, I wasn't really looking for anyone to design a box. I didn't want them to spend a ton of time designing a box, but I just wanted to see how they would react to that. And a lot of them just ask, okay, when do you need it by? And are there any parameters for the box? And I said, okay, that's great. I mean, that's a pretty typical response. But one of the candidates, she kept on peppering this manager with questions saying, who's it for? Like, what are we designing this box for? And what are we trying to get out of this exercise? And Brian didn't have any answers. And I said, it's fine. You don't have to have the answers. But I said, I do want to talk to her because I feel like that's asking the right questions. So it's sort of moving from thinking like an order taker and more thinking about what are we actually really trying to achieve. And we ended up hiring her, and she was great because she would push the team in a different way and to ask what felt like tough or awkward questions with some of our clients. But that's what I loved. And that's what, there's no, and I love the adage, there's no stupid questions, but I think it was a really, really great addition to the team because it sparked a different way of thinking about things.
This is a fantastic story. And I think it goes into a lot of this too, where leaders as organizations say that we want like innovative people who are ready to, I feel like inserting a bunch of buzzwords in here, like push the envelope and, innovate and everything like that. But, the real question is, are you sure? Because, when you have true innovation, it questions where you are today and questions the way you're doing it. So I've seen this trap before. It's like, we want innovation, but no, you know what? Do it this way. This is the way we've always done it. and that's where we have to be careful, right? So it's like, I think like this emerging or enduring way of leading is creating a set of shared beliefs and understanding the outcomes, right? And coaching as opposed to telling, right? I think that psychological safety, what we talked about, is one of those things that are like key to creating an environment that is truly problem solving and reaching to new heights, right? So really thinking about positive energies and attention to individuals, right? Thinking about the future states, not just the tasks that micromanage your way there, right? You know, we want to be open and comfortable with failure because that comes with true innovation, that comes with creativity, right? We have to be very good. Like psychological safety is absolutely key when we're talking about like giving feedback, right? Because you know what, like you could think about how easy it is to give certain feedback to a friend versus someone who might be a little bit more of a stranger, or someone who you don't know as well, or someone who you don't have a great relationship with, right? The two really different conversations, right? And I think it really comes down to, right, that as all people who work together, both like leaders or employees, I don't even feel like I want to create that divide anymore as much, but like we all have a responsibility, I think, to create this culture, right? You know, even if like the whatever HR department or you know, whatever C-suite department or even your manager isn't. I think like people have like this capability to manage up and really confront issues in a way that's non-confrontational, right? I think that should be like I think to go into this like, what is it? The true like emerging future state here, right? We need to be in conversations where the stakes are high, and when we have a difference of opinion, and when emotions are strong, we do need to say something, right? And we need to do it in a way that's empathic and moves things forward. Because usually, when stakes are high and emotions are high, it's either this fight or flight, right? And we don't want either of those to happen. We want to move forward together as friends or partners or colleagues, however we are, right? I have some few words on how to think through that I practice. But Chris, I wanted to hear from you. Any thoughts on that, or how you practice confronting issues or confronting the situation in a way that's non-confrontational?
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy. You know, going back to the idea that for a lot of leaders, you know, it's not always a natural kind of conversation, and I think it's sometimes you can go through the mechanics of just acknowledging what someone is saying and saying, I respect what you're saying, and then having as objective as possible a conversation about the issue at hand. And I think it's, you know, honestly, it's not easy. And when there is conflict, and there's always going to be conflict in the workplace, it's how do you have conflict or opposing ideas in a more constructive and healthy way. I still remember one of my favorite movies of all time is The Matrix, and there's a scene where Neo has to go through this one guy and they fight. They literally have a fight on top of these tables in order for him to get to the Oracle and have a conversation with the Oracle. And at the end of the fight, it was very amicably resolved, and the gatekeeper to the Oracle said, sorry about that. I had to do that because I had to know you better. And then he said something that really struck a chord with me, which is, you can never really know somebody until you fight them. And the reason why that stuck with me is I think it's pretty powerful, because I think when people are at their smallest, they tend to get defensive. They tend to get, they're in a different mode. It's a little bit more flight or fright. And a lot of leaders behave that way as well. And so, you know, one of the books that I really respect is, you know, Amy Edmondson out of Harvard Business School wrote The Fearless Organization. And you can also find her, I think she's done a TED Talk as well. and she talks about what psychological safety is and what it isn't. And I think a lot of people have this misgiving about psychological safety as either being about mental health or about making everybody comfortable, and it flies in the face of strong performance when in actuality, it's actually in service of a much better performing organization, because now you're removing these barriers and people aren't afraid to talk about things that are uncomfortable or are awkward or might be against the grain. So I think, for me, when I think about Pinaki, where do we go from here? How do we help our listeners tuning into this episode in terms of what kind of resource they can tap into? I think one of them is to give The Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson a read. And then there's one other great resource, which is, at home here for me in Canada, the Mental Health Commission of Canada has produced what is called the National Standard for Psychological Safety. And it's a complete standard. It goes across 13 factors in your organization that can give you a sense of where you're at in terms of psychological safety. And it also includes a toolkit about how you can move forward as an organization to foster much stronger sense of psychological safety in your company.
That's right on. You said something about like conflict that I resonated so much with me, right? I think you said like there'll always be conflict in an organization. And I feel like, take it a step further, there always needs to be conflict in an organization, because if there isn't, then you're just doing the same thing over and over again, right? So I think that's a brilliant statement, and you never know someone until you actually like fought them. You never get the real ideas until you get them to a place where they're comfortable just sharing and showing it to you. I didn't know a few things as far as what to do when you're confronting the issue, but trying not to be confrontational, right? So it's like, one, I think you have to like definitely know yourself, right? Like understanding yourself and the purpose why you're feeling this is right or wrong, whatnot, right? What's causing you to feel this way? Is it a story? Is it an assumption? Or is it something based on rooted fact? Because again, you have to have a level of skepticism even in yourself to understand this. The second thing is to listen intently. I think a lot of times we listen to counter or argument where we should be listening to understand and elevate or understand and resolve things, right? So, it's interesting, even questioning in a non-judgmental way is so important, right? Like confirming and encouraging other people's feelings, I think is really important. And and clarifying, I think, is super important as well. It's so many times where we're in the world moving so fast, using acronyms and jargon and words, and I think there's room for even clarifying. So even asking what I heard you say was or is this. And I think that having crucial conversations is an important part of business and being in the workforce. I think the one book I could recommend there is this Crucial Conversations, tools for talking when stakes are high. There's a few authors, including Carrie Patterson, on that one, but they go through this really interesting template or exercise that sticks with me. Start with heart, state the facts. What are the outcomes of those facts? What can I do differently? What could you do differently? Conversations don't always happen that robotically, but it is a framework to help you at least understand how to have these conversations, right? And I think that's going to be important to just creating a culture in your workforce that just replicates this to the organization. So it does feel human to say no at work or to disagree or to question and everything like that.
Yeah, I love that, Pinaki. I think that's a great blueprint for people to consider, and looking at different ways that you can give people it shouldn't even require courage. It should just be something that is part of regular everyday discourse where you feel free to be able to share your thoughts on something, obviously respectfully, but at the same time constructively, and something that helps us all as we move towards a common goal or vision. And so I couldn't agree more, Pinaki. I think those were really sage words of advice.
Absolutely, sir. And yeah, great tidbits. We hope you enjoyed. Chris just mentioned about culture, and it should just be part of the culture. And I think we're going to get into that in future topics as well. Until then, thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much, Pinaki. I really enjoyed this conversation and hope we can continue it.